The day Elvis knelt in the middle of the stage, what he said moved even the security guards. The sequined jumpsuit caught the spotlight as Elvis Presley dropped to his knees in the center of Madison Square Garden's stage. 20,000 people who had been screaming his name just seconds before fell into complete silence. The king of rock and roll, the man who never bowed to anyone, was kneeling. His voice cut through the hushed arena like a prayer. Today, I don't sing just for you. I sing to give thanks for life, for every opportunity, and for every soul that walks with me. Even the security guards, men trained to show no emotion, felt tears forming in their eyes. But this moment didn't happen by accident, and what led to it would change everyone in that building forever. June 10th, 1972. Madison Square Garden was alive with electricity. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation as 20,000 fans packed every seat, every aisle, every inch of space they could find. Elvis Presley was back in New York City, and the energy was unlike anything the venue had ever seen. If stories like this touch your heart, subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how Elvis touched your life. Backstage, Elvis adjusted his white jumpsuit with the golden eagle design. The costume weighed nearly 30 pounds, but he wore it like armor. Sweat already beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His band members were warming up, the familiar sounds of guitars and drums creating a rhythm that matched the thundering excitement beyond the curtain. "You ready for this, boss?" asked Jerry Sheff, his bass player, tuning his instrument one last time. Elvis nodded, but something felt different tonight. He couldn't shake a feeling that had been growing in his chest since he'd arrived at the venue. It wasn't nerves. He'd performed thousands of shows. It was something deeper, something that made him pause and look at his reflection in the dressing room mirror longer than usual. "Just remember," Elvis said to his band, his voice quieter than normal, "we're not just here to entertain tonight. We're here to connect." The musicians exchanged glances. Elvis had always been passionate about his performances, but tonight there was an intensity in his eyes they hadn't seen before. The crowd's roar reached fever pitch as the lights dimmed. Elvis walked onto the stage, and the explosion of sound that greeted him was deafening. Phones weren't invented yet, but flashbulbs popped like stars across the darkened arena. People were on their feet before he even reached the microphone. He launched into "CC Rider," his voice powerful and confident. The crowd sang along to every word, their voices mixing with his in perfect harmony. For 45 minutes, Elvis commanded that stage like the seasoned performer he was. He moved with the grace of a dancer and the power of a preacher, sweat glistening under the hot lights. But then something changed. During "Love Me Tender," Elvis stopped mid-verse. The band kept playing for a few seconds before realizing their leader had gone silent. One by one, the instruments faded until only the echo of the last note hung in the air. 20,000 people held their breath. Elvis stood at the center of the stage, his chest rising and falling heavily. His eyes scanned the crowd as if he was seeing each individual face for the first time. The spotlight created a circle of white light around him, and in that moment, something profound was happening inside the man who had been called the king. He raised his hand, and the gesture was so simple yet so commanding that the entire arena fell silent. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I need to tell you something." The silence was so complete that people could hear their own heartbeats. In the balcony, a woman named Margaret Chen clutched her husband's hand. She had saved for months to afford these tickets, hoping that Elvis's music might help her through the grief of losing her mother just weeks before. She had prayed in the taxi on the way to the venue, asking for strength to get through another day. Down in the orchestra section, a young man named David Santos sat with his father. David had been drafted and was shipping out to Vietnam in 2 weeks. His father had bought these tickets as a going-away gift, and both men were trying not to think about what the next months might bring. Throughout the arena, thousands of stories like these played out. People who had come seeking escape, comfort, hope, or simply a few hours of joy. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of what it meant to be human. Elvis looked out at these faces, and somehow he seemed to sense their need. Without warning, without any fanfare or explanation, Elvis Presley, the man who had conquered the world with his voice and his swagger, slowly lowered himself to his knees in the center of the stage. The white jumpsuit pooled around him like the robes of a monk, The golden eagle across his chest caught the light as his shoulders rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. His hands rested on his thighs, and his head was slightly bowed. The sight was so unexpected, so raw, that several people in the front rows gasped audibly. Backstage, Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and assistant, felt his knees go weak. He had been with Elvis through countless performances, but he had never seen anything like this. "What's he doing?" whispered Red West, one of Elvis's bodyguards. Nobody had an answer. On stage, Elvis lifted his head and looked directly into the crowd. His voice, when it came, was different from the powerful instrument they had been hearing all evening. It was softer, more vulnerable, but somehow it carried even more weight. "Today I don't sing just for you," he began, each word measured and deliberate. "I sing to give thanks for life, for every opportunity, and for every soul that walks with me." He paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the atmosphere of Madison Square Garden. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. "If there's one thing I've learned," Elvis continued, his voice growing stronger but no less gentle, "it's that without faith, you can't keep standing." Margaret Chen felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. The words hit her like a gentle hand on her shoulder, exactly what she needed to hear at exactly the moment she needed to hear it. David Santos reached over and squeezed his father's hand, both men understanding without words that they were witnessing something sacred. But it wasn't just the audience that was affected. Near the side of the stage, Big Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, and one of the toughest men in the business, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The security guards who lined the stage, men hired specifically because they could remain stone-faced in any situation, found themselves blinking back tears. Elvis remained on his knees for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When he finally stood, he moved with a different energy. The swagger was gone, replaced by something deeper and more profound. He walked to the piano at the side of the stage and sat down. His fingers found the keys, and the first notes of "You'll Never Walk Alone" filled the arena. But Elvis didn't sing alone. Margaret Chen was the first to join in, her voice trembling but clear. Then David and his father added their voices. Row by row, section by section, 20,000 people began to sing together. The sound was unlike anything Madison Square Garden had ever heard. It wasn't the wild energy of a rock concert or the formal precision of a choir. It was something entirely different. 20,000 individual voices coming together as one, each person singing not just the words but their hopes, their fears, their gratitude, and their faith. Elvis played the piano and sang, but he was no longer performing. He was leading something much more important, a moment of collective human connection that transcended entertainment and became something approaching the divine. Security guards who had worked hundreds of concerts found themselves singing along. Backstage crew members stopped their work to listen. Even the venue's janitors, who had been cleaning up in the distant corridors, made their way closer to hear what was happening. As the song reached its crescendo, Elvis stood from the piano bench and returned to center stage. His voice soared above the crowd, but instead of drowning them out, it seemed to lift their voices higher. Walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone, 20,000 voices sang as one. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before. It wasn't empty. It was full of shared emotion, shared experience, shared humanity. Elvis stood in that silence for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, sweat and tears mixing on his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard him. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for sharing this with me." The rest of the concert felt like a dream, wrapped in reality. Elvis continued performing, but everything had changed. The songs that followed, Suspicious Minds, Can't Help Falling in Love, Burning Love, were delivered with a depth of emotion that seemed to reach into the soul of every person in that building. But it wasn't just Elvis who had been transformed. Throughout Madison Square Garden, individual stories of change were unfolding. Margaret Chen sat in her seat, her hands still trembling slightly. The grief that had been crushing her chest for weeks felt different now, not gone, but somehow manageable. When Elvis had spoken about faith keeping you standing, she had felt her mother's presence so strongly, it was as if she were sitting right beside her. Margaret made a decision in that moment. Tomorrow, she would visit her mother's favorite charity and volunteer. She would find a way to honor her mother's memory through action, not just sorrow. David Santos and his father were having their own quiet revelation. The young man who would be shipping out to Vietnam in 2 weeks had been carrying fear like a stone in his stomach. But when 20,000 voices had joined together in song, David had felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving his draft notice. He was not alone. His father, a quiet man who struggled to express his emotions, reached over and whispered, "Son, whatever happens over there, remember this moment. Remember that you're part of something bigger." Near the stage, Big Joe Esposito was trying to process what he had just witnessed. He had been Elvis's road manager for years, had seen him perform in front of presidents and kings, had watched him command stages across the world. But this was different. Joe realized he wasn't just working for an entertainer anymore. He was working for a man who understood the weight of his influence and chose to use it for something profound. The security guards were having their own transformations. Rick Sullivan, a 28-year-old former Marine who had been hired specifically because he could remain emotionless in any situation, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about strength. He had been taught that real men didn't show vulnerability, didn't kneel, didn't cry. But watching Elvis, arguably the most powerful man in entertainment, choose vulnerability over strength had shaken something loose in Rick's carefully constructed walls. "Are you okay, man?" asked Tom Bradley, another security guard, noticing Rick wiping his eyes. "Yeah," Rick replied, but his voice cracked slightly. That was something else." Tom nodded. He understood. He had been working venue security for 15 years, had seen every kind of performer imaginable. But this was the first time a show had made him want to call his estranged brother and apologize for the fight they'd had 2 years ago. Backstage, the band members were dealing with their own emotional aftermath. Jerry Sheff, the bass player who had asked if Elvis was ready before the show, was sitting on an equipment case, staring at his hands. He had been a session musician for most of his career, treating performances like technical exercises. But what had just happened on stage wasn't about technical proficiency. It was about truth, raw and unfiltered. "Did you know he was going to do that?" asked Ronnie Tutt, the drummer, his voice barely above a whisper. Jerry shook his head. Nobody knew, but somehow it felt like it had to happen. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and assistant, was pacing back and forth in the wings. He had known Elvis since they served together in the army, had seen him through his divorce, through the pressures of fame, through the pills and the isolation that came with being the most famous man in the world. But tonight, Charlie had seen glimpses of the man Elvis used to be, the humble kid from Tupelo who just wanted to make people feel something. As the concert continued, word of what was happening inside Madison Square Garden began to spread beyond its walls. Venue staff who had stepped away from their posts to listen were calling their families, trying to describe something that couldn't adequately be described. Newspaper reporters who had come to write routine concert reviews were frantically rewriting their articles, knowing they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment journalism. Outside the venue, people who hadn't been able to get tickets were gathering, drawn by something they couldn't name. Taxi drivers were telling passengers about the energy they could feel just driving past the building. Hotel concierges were fielding calls from guests asking if they could hear singing coming from the direction of Madison Square Garden. But inside, the most profound changes were still happening. Elvis himself was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: complete presence. For so long, performing had become routine, a series of practiced movements and familiar songs delivered to audiences that blurred together. But tonight, he was acutely aware of every individual in that building. He could feel their hopes, their pain, their need for connection. When he launched into How Great Thou Art, his voice carried a weight that made hardened roadies stop what they were doing and listen. The song had always been one of his favorites, but tonight it felt like a conversation between Elvis and something larger than himself. Margaret Chen found herself standing without realizing it, her voice joining with Elvis's and thousands of others. The words, "How great thou art," seemed to pour out of her with a conviction she hadn't felt since before her mother's death. Beside her, strangers were holding hands, tears streaming down their faces. In the family section, David Santos and his father were standing as well. The older man had his arm around his son's shoulders, and both were singing with voices that shook with emotion. David felt something shift inside him, not the absence of fear about Vietnam, but the presence of something stronger than fear. When the song ended, Elvis walked to the front of the stage and sat down on the edge, his legs dangling like a child's. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it broke down the last barriers between performer and audience. "You know," he said, his voice conversational now, carried clearly through the sound system, "sometimes I forget why I started doing this. Sometimes the lights and the costumes and the business side of it all makes me forget that music is supposed to connect us." He looked out at the sea of faces, and it seemed like he was making eye contact with each person individually. "Tonight, you reminded me. Tonight, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost." The applause that followed wasn't the wild screaming of earlier in the evening. It was deeper, more sustained, the sound of 20,000 people acknowledging a shared truth. Elvis stood and walked back to the microphone stand. "I want to leave you with something tonight, something my mama used to tell me when I was scared or uncertain." The arena went completely silent again. She used to say, "Elvis, baby, when you don't know which way to go, you get down on your knees and you listen, not for answers necessarily, but for the strength to keep going." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight, when I got down on my knees on this stage, I wasn't putting on a show, I was listening. And what I heard was all of you, your hearts, your hopes, your faith. And it reminded me that we're all in this together." Margaret Chen was openly sobbing now, but they were healing tears. David Santos felt his father's hand squeeze his shoulder tighter. Throughout the arena, people were reaching out to strangers, offering comfort, sharing in something that felt bigger than any individual experience. Elvis picked up his guitar for the final song of the evening. "Can't Help Falling in Love" had ended countless Elvis concerts, but tonight it felt like a benediction rather than a performance. As he sang the opening lines, 20,000 voices joined him once again. But this time, it felt like they were singing not just to Elvis, but to each other, to life itself, to the mystery of human connection that could transform a concert hall into a sacred space. When the final note faded, Elvis stood at the center of the stage, his head bowed. The applause was thunderous, but underneath it was something else, a silence that felt full of gratitude and transformation. Elvis raised his head and looked out at the crowd one last time. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." As he walked off stage, Charlie Hodge was waiting in the wings. The two men looked at each other for a long moment before Charlie spoke. "Boss, that was—" "I know," Elvis said quietly. "I know." Years later, Margaret Chen would tell her grandchildren about the night Elvis Presley knelt on stage and helped her find her way through grief. David Santos would return from Vietnam and become a counselor, helping other veterans process their trauma, always remembering the night he learned that vulnerability could be a form of strength. Rick Sullivan would quit his job as a security guard and become a teacher, understanding that real protection comes from helping people feel safe to be themselves. Tom Bradley would call his brother the next morning and begin rebuilding a relationship he thought was lost forever. The concert reviews that appeared in newspapers the next day struggled to capture what had actually happened. Critics used words like transcendent and transformative, but everyone who had been in Madison Square Garden that night knew that words weren't adequate. What had happened was simpler and more profound than any review could convey. A man had chosen to be vulnerable in front of 20,000 strangers, and in that vulnerability, he had created space for everyone else to be human too. Elvis Presley would perform thousands more concerts in his lifetime, but he would often think back to the night he knelt in Madison Square Garden. It reminded him that his greatest power wasn't in his voice or his charisma. It was in his willingness to connect with the shared humanity that existed in every room he entered. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is get down on our knees and listen, not just for divine guidance, but for the voices of those around us who need to know they're not alone. Because in the end, we all walk through this world together. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to kneel, willing to be vulnerable, willing to be real, to remind us that faith isn't just about what we believe about the divine. Sometimes faith is simply about believing in each other.